Welcome. I'm Alfred Lemmermont Weber, and we're here again with Kevin Annett, who is the Field Secretary of the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State. Welcome, Kevin.
Hello, Alfred.
I know that matters have really become active here in the BC area, as well as worldwide, and we're very happy that you could join us for another update. Um, Tell us about what's been going on at the Port Alberni, BC area.
Well, a very important announcement has come out this last week. In mid-September, a group of pipe fitters, and this was communicated to me by one of the Aboriginal men who was a friend of one of these pipe fitters. These men discovered behind the Alberni Indian Residential School 30 small skeletons. That was in the third week in September. And these were of children, clearly. They were 3 feet or less in size. And in an area where a previous survey had found a whole series of sinkholes. So, in other words, these are clearly children who were buried there. And that information was just shared recently. And what was interesting was, not only is that more proof about the deaths of children in Indian residential schools in Canada, but in response, the Tribal Council, this is the New Chelmsford Tribal Council in Port Alberni, that's the main government-funded Native agency there. They announced a series of forums, which are happening now, where survivors of the Alberni Residential School are to tell stories of anything involving a practice in that United Church School of deliberately starving and experimenting on children. Now, the media and the Tribal Council, again, this is a government agency, the Chelmsford Tribal Council. Both the media and this government agency are acting like this is a new revelation. But here's an article that we actually released to the Canadian media, or rather the article is based on the information we released. It's dated April 26, 2000, so this is over 13 years old. And it's Native kids used for experiments. They describe 4 Indian residential schools in Canada, including in Alberni, where the health department, as far back as the 1940s, was deliberately denying dental care, vitamins, and food to children. They were deliberately starving them to death. And in fact, survivors who were speaking at our 1998 tribunal we held in Vancouver describe knowing that children had died as a result of these practices, and they were buried, again, behind the school where the skeletons were found recently. Now, clearly what's happened is, now that more evidence of children being buried at these schools has come out, and you can't stop this stuff from coming out, it's happening all over the country, the government-funded Native groups are being compelled to put their own spin on the whole story. That is to say, yeah, give us your evidence. And as at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, the government then owns and controls that evidence. And they can spin the issue any way they want. So unfortunately, these forums being held right now as we speak in Port Alberni is a way to get that evidence and control it, so that more of this clear evidence of genocide and murder in these schools can be suppressed by the government and the United Church colluding as they've always done. So to me, it's an example of how this issue doesn't seem to go away. The evidence keeps surfacing, and the government and their Native henchmen and the churches do their best to continue to keep burying it.
Now, does the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, or the common law courts of justice, is there any plan to revisit these issues, or?
Oh, very much. It's an ongoing issue. Now, as people know, we did begin a series of digs at the Mohawk School, the oldest Indian residential school in Canada, in Brantford, the Church of England school there. And remains of bones, buttons off school clothing, and that were found. Unfortunately, again, the government-funded tribal council there, the Six Nations Council, shut down that dig. However, in Port Alberni, we had a series of surveys done 5 years ago, and this is one of the maps done by the surveyors. And again, this showed that there were sinkholes, a series of sinkholes behind the school. Now, that happens when the ground depresses, when you dig a grave. After a few years, the ground actually depresses in very succinct, what are called sinkholes. And one of the people who did this survey had been to Bosnia and had experience in surveying mass graves. And they said, and this is a quote, "There's definitely graves in there." Well, again, this is the area where these 30 small skeletons just surfaced in September. So again, the tribunal has made it an ongoing priority to do that forensic investigation. Unfortunately, in Canada, the ground where these graves are on are owned by the government. It's so-called Crown land, and the native councils are, quote, colluding in that cover-up by not letting people in there to do the dig. We are, however, in the process of trying to secure international warrants which would allow forensic teams to go in there without the permission of the government and look for that proof on behalf of the families of these children who are still wondering how they died and where they're buried.
And has there been any follow-up from any of the alternative media or as to this Port Alberni find?
No, none whatsoever, which is not unusual for even the alternative media in Canada tend to just completely ignore this issue and avoid it. But, you know, as we mentioned, this is happening in a context where, don't forget, if people go to itccs.org, they can see all of the evidence that convicted the Crown of England, the United Church, the Catholic and Anglican churches for these crimes against humanity. That happened last February, the same month, not accidentally, that Pope Benedict resigned. That verdict established that the Crown of England and these churches are actual criminal bodies. They've committed genocide. They've lost their authority, you know, under international law, and people have every right to go in there and search for the remains of those children and access any other records or evidence these churches and governments are sitting on.
Now let's transit from here to the world scene, but still very much following the trail of the Vatican, one of the perpetrators of the genocide here in Canada. Recently, the Vatican missed a UN-imposed deadline on child trafficking. Could you fill us in on the background there and where exactly that's going?
Well, you know, the present Pope has been doing an amazingly effective public relations job to make it seem that he's trying to change the practices of the Church. Time magazine has even nominated him for Person of the Year on the basis of that myth, you know, that he's trying to change things. Here's the reality. You know, the words are one thing. The words he's spouting are one thing, but here's the reality on the ground. And this is an article from the Guardian newspaper, Friday, December 6th. Vatican refuses to give United Nations panel full details of clerical sex abuse cases. And this article describes, so basically the Vatican was given a deadline by the UN Commission on the Rights of the Child, where they had to produce the evidence of what cases they've documented in their own church of priests harming children and what are they doing about it. That the Vatican refused to provide them for that information, basically saying it's not their practice to disclose specific details. In other words, they're protecting the perpetrators. Now, that's of course they're going to do that because the standing policy, Crimen Solicitanis, and you can find that online, it's the policy in the Catholic Church governing the what happens when children are raped. And it basically says it's to be covered up and nobody's to be told. And anyone who tells not only gets excommunicated if you're a priest or a bishop, but you can now, under the rules brought in by the so-called reforming Pope on July 11th, you can now even go to a Vatican prison. You can be imprisoned for it. Now, as part of that July 11th apostolic letter that Pope Francis issued, it said that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and other, you know, international rights conventions are now going to be subsumed or contained within canon law. And at first people said, oh, well, that's good, you know. The reality is, by doing that, they're basically snubbing their nose at international law and saying, yeah, we'll apply those provisions if we want to. We are the law, and we'll apply international law and the rights of the children to ourselves if we want to. And this recent example of them ignoring the UN summons and deadline is a proof of how that happens in practice. They will ignore all laws and summonses to account for their behavior. So for anyone to imagine that that is an institution that's changing or reforming himself, it's pretty far-fetched. You know?
Well, for example, now you just mentioned that Pope Bergoglio received was named Time Magazine's Man of the Year, and that in fact Edward Snowden, who has given all of these revelations about the NSA surveillance, global surveillance on all cell phone calls, on all internet conversations worldwide, that has really changed things, that he was kind of pushed aside. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's kind of like when I was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize last year. I didn't get it either. A big surprise there. No, I mean, the international system works to protect the perpetrators and to punish people who are really trying to bring out the truth. And, you know, this is just another example of it. An interesting point about that people might appreciate is over the last couple of weeks, both of my laptops have been fried. They just don't operate anymore. And I took it to a well-versed techie guy who knows all about the internet and computers. And he said, and this is a direct quote from my friend Ian, he said, "I've never seen this happen to laptops before. I mean, you didn't even have it plugged into the internet, and I can't find the hard drive anywhere. It's being somehow taken out." And he said the only people who could do this is those who have technology far in advance of everybody else. So, I mean, the people going after Snowden, you know, or people like me, I mean, it's really all the same clique in terms of the power and technology they have. And it's not surprising. It's an example of how effective we're being. You know, and I often say to people, yeah, they may have a lot of formal power and everything, but they're scared because they know they're guilty. And that gives us a tremendous weapon. It means they can be provoked very easily, provoked to say things and reveal things. And that's always been one of our main methods to do that, you know.
Now, we're now coming toward the end of 2013 and looking forward to 2014. Could you lay out for us some of the plans of the Common Law Courts of Justice and the Tribunal for 2014?
Well, you know, in terms of the Tribunal, we are being very successful. We're now operating with groups or individuals in 21 countries. We started with 5. It's spread to countries like Egypt and Pakistan, where people are convening investigations into you know, all sorts of human rights issues involving, for example, one common issue that keeps coming up all the time is international child trafficking. We get the most number of requests from groups to do investigations into that. So this is really spreading. But in terms of the specific common law courts that are being established, we see in the United States and Canada especially them cropping up all over. There's now 5 in the US and 2 in Canada. And these are primarily working again on the issue of child trafficking and abuse within government child protection systems. And in the new year, there's going to be, as well on top of that and linking into that, a serious investigation, a common law court being convened into not only Jorge Bergoglio and the present Pope and his lineage and his crimes involving what he did in Argentina, but also the specific role of the Jesuits historically in these crimes. And, you know, the best example being there was the Jesuits who set up the model for these Indian boarding schools that slaughtered children all over the world. You know, so I mean, looking historically at that, but specifically as well, how the Vatican is tied into modern day child trafficking. And we know that through a lot of Catholic orphanages, adoption agencies and that, the Church has actually given a quota every year of children that are needed by these foster agencies and adoption agencies. And they go out and they convince young unwed mothers to sign away their children while in utero. And we have examples right here in Vancouver, Canada, of that still going on. And the Vatican traffics these fetuses. They traffic babies, you know, for a lot of money. That's one of the things that we're documenting. And definitely the real emphasis now is not only in convening these courts, but in enforcement. And so, for example, if you go to itccs.org, there's a common law court manual there showing people how to deputize police officers to be agents of the court, to set up common law peace officers that can detain known child raping priests and others who are guilty of these crimes. So the real effort now has to be into creating these enforcement bodies that can give teeth to these verdicts coming out of the common law court. So that's you know, what I'll be working on, and others will be working on in the coming year.
Right. Now, getting back to this new pope, we could almost call him the Teflon Pope. And how do you account for his being able to kind of pull the wool over the eyes of so many people, that is really promote PR? And let's just take an example, Crimen Solicitanis, where it appears as though he's reforming, when in fact he is making the child trafficking and child abuse apparatus, he's facilitating it.
That's right. He's institutionalizing it even more.
Yeah.
And that's why you need a distraction of reform while you're closing the information leaks. I mean, that's been an old practice. Machiavelli in The Prince suggests that to rulers, that's exactly what you do when you're in crisis. You shut down any further evidence coming out while feigning reform to distract and fool people. So I mean, it's an old trick. But as to how we can do it, well, the Vatican has an income just from the collection plate every year of $30 to $50 billion. And it's when you think of all the corporate investments and the money and the political influence, the Concordat agreements where taxpayers' money are funneled from over 100 countries right to the Vatican Bank. I mean, the money will allow you to do almost anything, right? But it's also, this whole myth that the Vatican has something to do with Christianity. We know that if you examine their doctrines, that's not true. And so, it's that psychological and financial and political power. They have to do anything they want. But again, it's really amazing how with all that influence, they still have to resign. The Pope and Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone still resigned last year because of the truth of their actions coming out. So in a way, it doesn't really matter what kind of power they have. The truth is more powerful. The truth trumps any maneuver, by those very human institutions to cover up their crimes. So, I think it's all of that, but we're showing in practice that can be negated in terms of the guilt of these people.
Now, if people would like to become more involved in supporting the work of the Tribunal or in contacting you, how can they do that?
Well, www.itccs.org, hiddennolonger.com, where you can see the specific evidence of genocide in Canada, and my email, hiddenfromhistory1, like number 1, hiddenfromhistory1@gmail.com. Especially want to put out an appeal to Canadians to get off their behinds and start helping us enforce these nullification orders against the Catholic and Protestant churches here in Canada that are guilty of these crimes. The Crown of England doesn't have legitimate authority anymore because its head, Elizabeth Windsor, is a convicted felon. And so I would say to everybody who's taken an oath of allegiance to Queen Elizabeth, whether it's here in Canada, in England, Australia, any so-called Commonwealth country, to realize that you are committing a crime when you act in her name, that you owe an allegiance to the people and not to convicted heads of state. And so that's an appeal for people to come over and to do the right thing. So I think that's generally true about anyone within the Catholic world as well, that the time is over where people can pretend these crimes aren't going on. Children are being trafficked and killed as we speak. And people who put money in that collection plate are facilitating that, are guilty of a crime.
Right. And would you like to leave us with a seasonal and New Year's message for our listeners?
Well, Christmas was never traditionally a Christian holiday anyway. It's actually a Roman, the festival of Saturnalia was a Roman rite on December 25th. But, this time of year, there's the so-called Santa Claus myth that we perpetrate for the sake of the kids, so we don't upset them. I often think the Pope's authority is similar. As a matter of fact, Geoffrey Robinson, a lawyer in England, wrote a book called The Case of the Pope, where he dismantles the whole claim that the Vatican is a government, which it isn't under international law. But he says it's a Santa Claus state. It's what we governments pretend exists so we don't upset the kids, right? All of us slaves out there who really have to keep funding the government and the churches and especially the Vatican. Otherwise, they might wake up and realize it's all being a lie, being told to them. So, I mean, I think at this time of year, we don't have to tell the kids there is a Santa Claus any more than we need to tell people the Pope is a legitimate authority in the world, let alone having anything to do with Jesus Christ. So that's the message, and also one of hope that, you know, the fact that I'm still walking around means that truth has a power and it gives you a protection, which I couldn't have foreseen 10 or 20 years ago. And a lot of good spirits out there, you know, who are protecting this work, the children who are still waiting to come home, to have the truth be known and the perpetrators brought to justice. All of that is keeping us going, and I would urge people to look to that force, and not to your fear and not to your intimidation by these paper tigers out there.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and we look forward to your coming back again with updates as the work progresses.
Thank you, Alfred. I appreciate it.